Good morning, students. I'm going to be talking with you this morning about organizing. And there's several different components to this particular category. I hope you have in front of you the slides identified for Dunn and Heyman's chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. The title of the slide number 1 is Organizing. I will be working through a portion of these slides, then I will stop, and then I'll pick up in part 2. So this is basically part 1. Turning to slide number 2, if I were to read, much less answer, all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out, all right. What is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, then angels swearing I was right would make no difference. That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. You can turn to slide number 3, and here's a little cartoon from Mr. Larson. Think about it, Ed. The class Insecta contains 26 orders, almost 1,000 families, and over 750,000 described species. But I can't shake the feeling we're all just a bunch of bugs. Moving on to, well, I'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, this is obviously speaks to the organization that we are familiar and comfortable with in the animal kingdom. So human beings, we don't get quite so descriptive in my mind about our organizational structures, but that's basically what we're going to be talking about this morning. So you'll see on slide 4 some questions. I won't go through those questions. You can read those and think about them and maybe even answer a few at your leisure. Let's turn to chapter 11, Fundamental Concepts of Organizing, slide number 5. Moving on to slide 6, there's some major principles of that I think are helpful for you all to know. It's called formal organization theory. So authority is the lifeblood of the managerial position. If you end up in a managerial position, you're going to be given authority of some sort. It might be clinical, it might be over staff members, it might be budgetary, it might be financial authority, it might be planning authority, it might be all of those. Span of management or control sets limits on the number of subordinates. So one of the things we talk about in our hospitals and on our nursing units is what is an acceptable span of control? How many people can any one person be responsible for at any given time? Division of work, then, is another principle. It's an essential for efficiency. And you're all very familiar with this because we have lots of conversations about what are RNs capable of doing, what are LPNs, what are nurse aides capable of doing. If you might be working in an ER, you might be very cognizant of what is the extent that a tech of services, what can a tech provide versus an RN? And then, of course, going a different direction on the organizational ladder, you might think about, what in our organizations, what are physicians privileged to do that others are not. So division of work is an essential component. Number 4 is a formal structure is the main network of an organization. And you can always find this in an org chart. If you haven't seen the organizational chart for your organization or for your unit, ask for it. Somebody should be able to find that quickly for you and give it to you. And it's never a secret. Org charts help us understand relationships within an organization. Then unity of command must prevail. Basically that means that, everybody with working within an organization are kind of on the same page. We assign some different topics to it we call about walk the talk. So if we say we're going to be providing a certain kind of service, then we have to be cognizant and intent about that. Our safety huddles are probably a recent example of unity of command. In some organizations, most hospitals, I think, in this day and age, they will have a safety huddle at 9 a.m. or early in the morning every day, and it's the department directors, the clinical department directors in particular, but others like IT and housekeeping, all department directors huddle for about a 15 to 20 minute stand-up meeting, and they talk about what are the safety concerns of that day. And finally, number 6, coordinating activities and resources is the primary responsibility of management. And so oftentimes that's what we think about, is the whole coordination. So let's move on to slide number 7. This slide talks about power and authority. Power in an organizational sense is basically the ability to influence others to influence others or get others to act in a certain way. And we talk about 3 different kinds of power. Coercive power is not a good kind of power. That's power based on fear. Reward power is power based on ability to distribute something of value. And that's not always, the something of value is not always a paycheck, although that does factor in. And then referent power is a definition or speaking about power based on personal attraction of an individual or desire of other people to be like that person. Referent power in an organization is generally the most sought after kind of power. You want to be like, you want to emulate someone because of the characteristics that you find in that person. And then I put in, they talk about charismatic authority, authority that stems from compelling personal characteristics and charism of a leader. We're not going to get deep into leadership theory in this course, but suffice it to say that great leader theory is still alive and well. I've included a quote from Abraham Lincoln. In my mind, he is one of the greatest leaders that United States has ever seen. But he was human too. Every great leader also has feet of clay. And in today's more complex world, assigning all leadership to one person usually doesn't work very well. So let's move on to management characteristics. And here we see I've compared what we might call Newtonian management characteristics with 21st century leader. I won't read through this list. You can read it at your leisure. But Newtonian, suffice it to say, is much more about a vertical orientation. There's a hierarchy. There's generally top-down decision-making. We continue to see this in a lot of our organizations, but I believe that we're moving more towards a 21st century leader that's deconstructing barriers and structures, embracing new technologies as a way of doing work, creating a safe milieu for the struggles and pain of change, enumerating small successes, celebrating the journey. You can read through that. But the 21st century leader, in my mind, takes on more humanistic characteristics as opposed to more manufacturing or, assembly line characteristics. So slide number 9 invites you to go listen to a TED Talk by Simon Sinek. It's leadership and safe environments. So the 2 questions on this slide are going to be posed on the discussion board, and I want you to go out and answer these 2 questions after you have watched Simon Sinek. This particular TED Talk is, it's not terribly long. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 or 12 minutes. You can break right now and do that and come back to this lecture, or you can do it later. But the 2 questions that I will want you to answer on the discussion board is, how might you encourage greater safety where you work, and what qualities do you most admire in a leader? Now let me clarify this whole issue about safety a little bit. This is not about clinical safety or the safety that we ordinarily think of in our organizations. This is about safety for the worker in terms of, how am I being treated by management? Do I feel safe? Do I feel trusted? And have I built a level of trust with the management, either the supervisor that I'm reporting to or the whole management structure of the organization. So, a TED Talk for you to listen to. Then I included just a chart with, or a slide that depicts some organizational charts. The one on the left is probably more traditional in terms of what we see. It's interesting with technology, we can now create organizational charts that sit online and actually give you pictures of people. And I think that's always helpful. It's nice to be able to connect a name with a face and lessens the distance, if you will, the kind of the emotional distance that people always feel between themselves and a managerial person. So let's move on to slide number 11, division of work and departmentalization. Here's a proverb. He is a wise man who always knows what to do next. Isn't that an interesting? I have a good friend who has spent time in some different groups, and she always says to me, Charlotte, what is the next right thing to do? So that puts an ethical connotation on it, but he is a wise man who always knows what to do next. So let's look at departmentalization a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some different pieces and bring in some additional resources for you. So departmentalization is a way of talking about function, process, territory, customers, time, and products. And you can see I've used some examples here from our healthcare world. So a finance department has a specific function. Nursing department would have a specific function. So sometimes we talk about a department based on its function. Sometimes we talk about a department based on the process or the equipment. So imaging. So imaging is actually a process that is used, obviously in healthcare, to help us diagnose what might be going on with a particular patient. IT is another way to think about that. It might be a territory. So the emergency department is an example. Or it might be based on the customer. So pediatrics would be an example. We do medical, surgical, we take care of lots of different issues in a pediatric department, but it's named pediatrics because of the customer that it deals with. Sometimes it's a time. We don't usually think of a shift as a department, but certainly those of you who have worked nights or might be working nights right now, you quickly learn who else is in the building, and it's not always nursing. I mean, there's other folks that you connect with readily, as other folks do on days and evenings. But nights in particular have generally develop their own kind of camaraderie, their own culture. And then finally, it might be product, and cardiology, oncology, psychiatry are examples of those. Well, let's move on to slide 14. I want to talk a little bit about service line structure, because I know service line is at least something that I had worked on a lot within St. Elizabeth and CHI Nebraska. I think it's continuing to capture a fair amount of attention. So my source here is SG2. SG2 is a consulting company for hospitals. So I borrowed some information that they had shared with us through the years. So essential framework is that a service line structure extends across the continuum. So it speaks to not only what might be happening in the physician office or even patients receiving care, but then all the way through, and I kind of draw a curve, all the way through a hospital and potentially post-acute care. Another component of service line structure is there's regional planning and control. And I know within CHI that might be happening, CHI Health, that might be happening right now. And basically service lines are positioned to manage broad populations. So what are some of our service lines? Cardiology, oncology, women and children's health can be considered a service line. Let's see, surgical specialties, basically the impact of an OR. Those are also service lines. Psychiatry, as we mentioned in that previous slide. And then you can see there's some key competencies that are identified with this service line structure. there's a kind of point out one in particular that I think is interesting, is hardwiring the analytics to better inform strategy and operations. So all of the data that might be accumulated around a particular product service line like cardiology could all come together and help both strategy and operations. Built-in flexibility. Again, you can read some of those key competencies. Moving on to slide 15, there are advantages and there are challenges to adopting a service line structure. Some of the advantages, we can begin now to really talk about care continuity. We can talk about being cohesive across the service line, responds to some payment innovation, hopefully increases patient satisfaction. Service line structure should essentially decrease the fragmentation that we've all gotten pretty used to, those of us that work in healthcare, but the patient, it doesn't always help the patient. On the other hand, there are challenges. Probably the biggest is it adds complexity, and it can mess with traditional managerial lines. Like if I'm working in a cardiovascular nursing unit, do I report to the the service line manager for cardiology, or do I report to nursing? Those are always relationships that have to be worked out. Moving on to slide 16, again, some advantages and challenges. Basic issue here is how to regionalize planning and control. Some of the advantages, it can create economies of scale. Service line structure can create economies of scale. It can minimize internal competition. Again, I'm just picking out a few of these. On the other hand, it may spur some conflict across different sites. It can complicate or stall daily operations, and that may be a concern. It may also add costly administration, and I know that CHI Health is looking at all of those. And then a final comment about service line structure. It is positioned to manage broad populations. So, as we think about how do we do population health going forward under healthcare reform, this may allow us to function better within healthcare reform. Some of the new payment models that are coming out. Again, you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide, though, challenges. Concern about adding overhead of cost. It targets populations that have classically been poorly engaged in healthcare. And so, again, you can see there are advantages and disadvantages to service line structure. My personal opinion is it is the way to go, but I don't think we have it right yet. So with that, I'm going to stop and re-engage with you on the next in part 2.